Good morning. My name is Steve Drovitsky, Director of the Rockefeller Center of Latin American Centers of Harvard, .Plus, and welcome to this seventh webinar of the Academical Forum for the New Constitution of Chile. Today we will be talking about the new constitutional system of Chile, presidential, semi-presidential, or parliamentarism. The event has been organized by .Plus and particularly by the office in Santiago de Chile and the program called Andes and Connoisseur. I want to thank our 6 panel members today, particularly our international speaker, John Doray, my friend for long. And I want to thank as well, especially to Marcela Rementeria, who is the executive director of our office in Chile. Marcela, she is the brains and the driving force of this series. I want to thank as well, particularly to Jimena Codina in Cambridge and for Santiago as well. As you will know, the constitutional process in Chile has been followed very attentively, not only in Chile, but in many parts of the world. Chile is not only the only democracy in Chile that is suffering a strong legitimacy crisis, but it's one of the few countries that is seriously trying to rethink the rules of the game of democracy and to rethink the relationship between the citizens and the state before coming to a serious crisis against democracy, before a coup, before an election can be won by an authoritarian populist. The process in Chile has been quite innovative in several aspects. I believe that the final result of it is still a mystery, but there is an extreme polarization climate, and the campaign is quite polarized as well. That is affecting the deliberations and the work of the assembly. But the Chilean process offers at least the possibility of building a political system that can be more participatory, much more responsive. And if this happens, Chile could become a model, a regional model of institutional reform. It can be a source with lessons that can be useful for other countries, Latin America, but also in the United States, a country that needs to reform some aspects of the constitution as well. Along this constituting process of Chile, this process has considered an open debate and high quality, particularly on some of the subjects that are faced by the Chileans when rethinking their constitution. And our idea has been that of gathering experts from different parts of the world with academic people and with players in Chile in order to deliberate this issue from different visions and from different ideologies. This forum not only is directed to the Chileans, but also to a wider audience that goes to all Latin Americans, many parts of the world, because we believe that the Chilean process could have interesting lessons for many other countries, including mine. In fact, this forum has summoned more than 1,000 participants from more than 24 countries: Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, even Germany, Norway, France, Indonesia, and Japan. So the elements are auspiced by other institutions, Chilean academic institutions such as the Instituto de Estudios Públicos from the Universidad de Chile, as well as the Universidad Diego Portales, the Faculty of Law of the School of Government of Catholic University of Chile, and the Millennium Institute and the Chilean Association of Harvard. I've got the fortune to have an extraordinary consultative board with 7 different professors, Mr. Figueroa, Claudio Fuentes, Claudia Hayes, Juan Pablo Luna, Cristian Rodriguez, Sol Serrano, and Sebastian Soto, and helping our panel members, the members of this consulting board. They are moderators as well. And today our moderator is Claudio Fuentes, politologist. But before going to Claudio, several logistic things. First, this event is being recorded, and therefore you will have access to it through several channels. Webpage of Dr. Class and YouTube of Dr. Class. There is an interpretation, English and in Spanish. We're going to have presentations in both languages. If you want to listen in your own language, you just have to press the button on interpretation, and you will have the possibilities open. If you have any question, send us through Q&A button, which is at the bottom line of your screen. And then, after the presentations, Claudio Fuentes will then take some questions. I cannot promise that we are going to answer all of them, but some of them at least. This event is 1 and 45 hours. It could be a little bit longer depending on the questions and answers. So we will be finishing by 1 o'clock in Santiago de Chile. Our moderator is Claudio Fuentes, Professor Claudio Fuentes. He is a professor, titular professor of the School of Political Science and working in the Constitution aspect as well. Universidad Diego Portales, their research has been oriented to the Chilean processes in politics and Latin America, with a focus on the studies of the dynamics of changes in constitution. He has published several books on the Chilean democracy, including the transition, unfinished transition towards a democracy, and several articles in English and in Spanish for a long period of time on the need and the dilemmas of the constitutional reform in Chile. Claudio integrated the presidential anti-corruption consulting board in the last government of Bachelet, and he has been working in with Harvard for long as well. Thank you, Steve, for your presentation. I will go directly to present or to introduce the panel and to talk about this issue. If there is an issue that has generated divisions, where there is a very clear position, is a debate on the government system. We are in a constitutional or constituting process. In the different commissions, debates have been started on this issue, and there is a particular one on what is the system to be chosen. Most of the constituent parts or constituent persons, they wanted to reduce a little bit the presidential system, but there is no clarity in terms of going into a semi-presidential or a parliamentarian one, or maintaining the one that we have today. But the debate is quite interesting because it shows different opinions, and there is room for institutional innovation, and this takes us to a very long-lasting question that has been in public policies and law has been quite clear. Up to what extent the institutions help and favor governability, and what is the kind of a model that we can think of. In order to talk about this, we have a big panel member, John Kerry. He is an associate teacher of the Faculty of Social Science in Diamond College. An extensive curriculum that I'm not going to read at all, but he has worked in institutional reform, electoral reform, and besides, he has been in Chile for a long period. He was teaching in the Catholic University, and he has been working in designs of different systems of elections in different parts of the world. The idea is that John will talk for 20 minutes, and then we are going to listen to the Chilean group, which is not that Chilean group because we have some people from other countries, but they are living in Chile. They are 5. We are going to be introducing each of them in Pamela Figueroa, Ignacio Walker, Flavio Quesada, Valeria Balance, and Lucas Sierra, that so kindly they have accepted to participate in this debate. So please, John, 20 minutes for you for your presentation. Thank you for being here. Thank you very much to Claudia and Steve and the Rockefeller Center for organizing this event and inviting me to participate. And thank you to the other panel members and everybody participating in our discussion. I would like to say some things in order to just give you the context. First, my apologies. First, your patience, because I'm going to give this presentation in English.
And second, switching to English, that I will offer. I will not offer much commentary on the current status of constitutional debates in Chile or on Chilean politics more generally. There was a time when I knew Chilean politics pretty well, and when my Spanish was strong enough for me to deliver this presentation. I lived in Santiago in 1993 and 1994 and taught at the Instituto de Ciencia Política at the Universidad Católica. It was a formative time for me intellectually, and I still carry tremendous affection for the country and a fascination for its politics. But other projects have claimed most of my attention in recent years, and my opportunities to travel to Latin America and to exercise my Spanish have been rare, so I will offer some comments in English about the broad topic of today's discussion about presidentialism, parliamentarism, and hybrid political regimes. And then I will defer to the other panelists for insights into contemporary Chilean politics, including into the events of the last 48 hours, which rightly command our attention. I'm going to try to share my screen here. Is that good? Okay, excellent. Super. So I think the central question behind today's broad topic is, does constitutional regime type affect outcomes that we care about? And this was, of course, the question that Juan Linz famously asked about 30 years ago, and his answer was yes. And I'd summarize Linz's central claim as follows. I think he said, if Latin America had had parliamentarism instead of presidentialism in the middle of the 20th century, it might have avoided 17 years of military rule in Chile and 20 years in Brazil, it might have avoided Argentina's dirty war and a host of other catastrophes. Now, Linz's work had enormous influence on political scientists, including myself. But in the years since he wrote, constitutional designers have mostly ignored his recommendations. Presidential systems and hybrid regimes that combine popularly elected presidents with some measure of cabinet dependence on parliament have multiplied far more rapidly than pure parliamentarism, to the point where there are now about equal numbers of democratic regimes in each category. And these data are a little bit out of date, but still pretty accurate. What this shows is the sort of proportion of regimes that are parliamentary, that are semi-presidential, and that are presidential over a 50-year period or so. And we can see that the initial big rise of presidential democracies was driven by the transitions back to democracy in Latin America in the 1980s. And that in the 1990s, there was a real spike in the proportion of hybrid regimes, mainly driven by transitions to democracy in East Europe and in the former Soviet Union. The scholarly research that followed from Lin's and the experience of many Latin American countries, including Chile, showed that presidentialism is not necessarily a recipe for democratic regime collapse or for the impossibility of stable party coalitions in support of presidents. But presidential democracies do operate differently from parliamentary ones on a number of counts. Legislative parties and coalitions exhibit lower voting unity under presidentialism than under parliamentarism. Presidents have lower success rates than do parliamentary executives in getting their policy initiatives approved as law. There are more broken campaign promises, and there's less mandate accountability under presidentialism than under parliamentarism. What I show you next is a series of figures that plot various outcomes against national wealth for three types of political regimes: presidential, parliamentary, and hybrid regimes. We know that lots of outcomes we care about, including democratic performance, but also indicators of human well-being, are strongly correlated with wealth. And so it's important to take wealth into account. And in these figures that I'll show you, I measure wealth here as purchasing power per capita to account for how differences in currency values can affect prosperity. But beyond wealth, these figures that I'll show you do not pretend to control for any other factors that might affect the outcomes I examine. So they're crude models. But the patterns that they illustrate are, I think, striking. I looked at all the democracies, and the definition I use for democracy is that they have a polity score of 5 or greater. Polity, you may know, is an international consortium that rates every country's democratic performance each year. And I looked at countries with populations of more than 1 million people. The data I'll show you are from 2014, but I'm confident that more recent data would show similar patterns. So in the figures, presidential regimes are marked by red X's, parliamentary regimes by green dots, and hybrid regimes by blue triangles. And we can look quickly at the scatter plots that I will show you and size up whether one regime type or another is overperforming or underperforming relative to other regime types at the same level of wealth. Taxation is widely recognized as a cornerstone of government capacity to deliver public goods. And we know that wealthier states tend to tax at higher rates than poorer states. Nevertheless, if we look at the distribution of regimes in this figure, and look at the ones that are above and below the linear best fit line, that's the orange line going across the figure, we can see that parliamentary regimes are about twice as likely to be overperformers than underperformers, and that for presidential regimes, the reverse is true. In this plot, which summarizes the same data from the figure above, the green line shows the linear fit for the relationship between per capita wealth and taxation for presidential regimes, and the blue line shows the same linear fit for parliamentary and hybrid regimes. And we can see that there's a positive relationship, or that the positive relationship we see overall is driven by the latter set, by the parliamentary and hybrid regimes. Wealthier presidential democracies actually tax marginally less as a share of gross domestic product than do poorer ones. And the reverse is true among parliamentary and hybrid regimes. And I'll note that in the figures I'm going to show you today, I'm going to compare presidential regimes against parliamentary and hybrid regimes pooled together just for presentational simplicity. We could, of course, separate out each regime type or any other institutional feature of interest, but in the interest of simplicity, and because presidentialism is the default in Chile and in most of Latin America, I'm going to use that as the point of comparison. But maybe the tax share of GDP is not an ideal measure of regime performance. So let's consider some other things that are also affected by government policies in pursuit of public welfare. This next slide shows Gini indices of economic inequality plotted against per capita wealth. So the higher the index, the more unequal is the distribution of wealth in a society, and the lower the index, the more equality we see economically. Now, there's substantial dispersion in this scatter plot, but on the whole, wealthier societies are slightly less unequal than poor ones. But again, look at the relative distribution of presidential as opposed to parliamentary regimes in this figure, above and below the best fit line. Or easier, here are the linear fits for presidential and for the pooled set of parliamentary and hybrids across the whole distribution of regimes. Economic inequality rises with wealth among presidential regimes, whereas it declines in the others. If we look at poverty rather than at economic inequality, we don't get as dramatic a difference between regime types. Poverty is lower in richer countries across all regime types, but presidential regimes have slightly higher poverty rates, about 10% higher across all levels of income measured. So the presidential regimes are in the green again, and the parliamentary and hybrid regimes are in the blue. Another conventional indicator of government accountability is corruption. So let's take a look at Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. And remember here, higher corruption perception index scores represent less perceived corruption among Transparency International's survey respondents. So higher scores here are less corrupt. The pattern here suggests that as countries increase in per capita wealth, the rate of improvement on corruption is flatter among presidential regimes than among parliamentary systems and hybrid. So everybody improves as wealth increases, but the rate at which we see improvements in corruption is faster among parliamentary and hybrid regimes. We get a similar kind of pattern if we consider another key government function, that is guaranteeing individual physical security. These data show homicide rates from the United Nations. Again, there's a general pattern of greater security in richer countries, but the rate of improvement with wealth is flatter among presidential regimes than in the others. So I've shown you a lot of data here. In closing, I want to emphasize two caveats, and then also to ask to my fellow panelists a question. First, the caveats. These scatter plots may be suggestive, but they just show correlations. They do not meet the standards that political scientists or economists would require to claim causal relationships. There may be other unobserved factors that are correlated with regime type, maybe even that are causing regime type, that are pushing presidential democracies toward worse performance than parliamentary and hybrid regimes. And it's important to acknowledge. Second, our fellow citizens generally don't care what political scientists think. And if you ask citizens, would you prefer to vote directly for your chief executive or for the executive to be selected by the legislature? You should expect them to choose presidentialism every time. Presidentialism has immensely strong popular appeal for exactly this reason. And making the case for parliamentarism is a lot easier in a forum like this one than it is in the real world of politics. So I will stop here, and I hope my colleagues can tell us much more about what's likely to happen in the real world of Chilean politics and why. And I thank you for your attention.
Perfect, and thank you very much, John, for your presentation and for all your data and for the timing. Quite impressive. Let's go now to a round of comments on this issue. We have then the question on the government system, and we will start by Pamela Figueroa. Pamela Figueroa, she is a professor of the Instituto de Estudios Avanzados, Advanced Studies of the Universidad de Santiago de Chile, and the coordinator, academical coordinator of an observatory of new constitution, as it is called, which has done a very important contribution to the debate by then making a follow-up of this constituting process. Pamela has worked in the division of studies of the ministry called Secretaría General de Gobierno in the government of Bachelet, and she worked in the coordination of this process of new constitution. 10 minutes for you, Pamela, please. Okay, Claudio, thank you very much. Please, you let me know about timing. First of all, I want to thank this center, the David Rockefeller Center from the University of Harvard, and through the director, Mr. Levinsky, for this invitation, and to thank the presentation by John Kerry that obviously he has been a reference for many of us, and I just will present my comments based on what John said, but also on what the debate has been in the case of Chile in terms of the change of the political regime and the new constitution. I think that there are interesting things that were presented at the beginning by Steve. He talked about innovation that this system is doing through the Constitutional Assembly, and particularly on the political regime, we could have some innovations and lessons to be learned. But also, it is quite interesting the perspective presented by John in terms of the performance of the different political regimes, as well as demythification of some regimes, the presidentialist, semi-presidentialist, or the parliamentarist one, could have a better performance than others. We know from the political science the arguments that have been presented for and against. But particularly because of the data presented by John are quite interesting in terms of poverty, inequality, development, which is quite an important factor to understand the possible election of a political regime. It is also relevant what John said in terms of the reception that both the civil society and the politicians can have in terms of these issues. In the observatory that I work in, we have studied the proposals from the constituent panel members have mentioned, and most of them in Chile, they would express their idea of what they call a semi-presidentialism without considering a deepened study on this, on what would be the implication. But it is quite clear that there is a consensus from the convention people that the hyper-presidential system of Chile, and I repeat, hyper-presidentialism as defined by Mr. Nido, is something which is quite necessary to take it into a reform. And this is a consensus that has been developed through the civil society into the dialogues that were taken by the government of Michelle Bachelet. Most of the people, they would try to attenuate this presidentialism. Even in these citizens' dialogues, there were innovative proposals such as unicameralism or unit chamber. That is to say, and this has become a consensus, more or less, I would say, in Chile, particularly because we were keen on an extreme presidentialism. We have come to a point that is generating a political crisis, sharing what John said, that this regime is not the only factor that explains a political crisis and social crisis um, as the one that we are living in Chile. But within this shared knowledge and shared diagnosis, there is a relationship between the executive and the legislative powers that all through the transitional process and with the binominal system that we used to have in Chile came to the final part of a cycle, um, because that was a veto from the minority. It was very difficult to generate a majority-based government. Not even the second term of Michelle Bachelet, with majority in both chambers, could establish this majority kind of a government, and she could not advance and progress in the program of her government because the majorities could not be reached because of this veto power of the minority. So quorum was were very difficult to overcome. Together with my colleagues, Mr. Eizaguirre and Jornal, we have done a publication that we did a diagnosis on this hyper-presidentialism, and we have talked about what John Kerry called a hybrid system. Our proposal says that the relationship between the legislative and the executive is blocked. We have a president with multiple faculties, but the Congress impedes him to go with his own program because there is no majority in both chambers. We have multipartyism as well, exacerbated, weak political parties. Presidentialism worked in Chile when there was a big and strong political countries, but 10 years ago, more or less, well, the political parties became much weaker. Then we had the presence of leaders, of personal leaders, and the reform that we had in 2015 does not correct these leaders present in and different kind of interpretations that are aspects that we have visualized in the last years. This also makes that we have a weak Congress, weak political parties without responsibilities and forced to come to a very kind of a consensus policies, in fact. So the debate on the constitutional change in Chile in terms of the political system is defined in terms of where the center of power will lie. Is going to be in the executive? We still maintain presidentialism or any kind of presidentialism, or is it going to be lying in the parliamentarism, that is to say, more inclined towards a parliament, maybe? And we have to answer the question: if we wanted to have a majority kind of a government, do we want to build a coincidence between legislative and the executive? And those are the questions. What is the system of parties? We have multipartyism. There was an attempt to correct it with the reform to the binominal system. It didn't work, and the current legislation goes for this multipartyism. How we're going to build our Congress? Only one chamber, two chambers, how this representation is going to be like. And this is also something which is in debate today, to be defined today. And another basic thing that is posing this system is that we are not only talking about a new balance between the legislative and the executive, but we have to incorporate a third player, which is citizenship, in fact, global democracies in the crisis of the representative democracy, they have to open and observe how to incorporate participation mechanism and deliberation mechanism for the citizens in order to come to this balance between the legislative and the executive. This is because we are living in a crisis of representation and trust. We have to give new legitimacy to this political system, and as in some countries of Latin America, Uruguay, for example, we do have instruments of participatory democracy that might be complemented. I also think that we have to say that we need to have an inclusive system, including the First Nations, for example, to distribute the power on a territorial basis, and that would check institutions such as the Constitutional Tribunal, the system of rights that are going to be important aspects of the constitutional aspect. I believe that those are the elements that from what John has said, and obviously we can deepen up in the questions and answers period. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much, Pamela. Here we've got some concrete proposals over the table, so it's quite interesting to debate on this issue now. Valeria, please. Valeria Valenza, she's a teacher, associate teacher in the Institute of Political Science from Catholic University of Chile. She's a PhD in political science, and the last book is Checking Presidential Power, so it's quite relevant for the discussion. To have your view, Valeria, please, 10 minutes. Thank you, Claudio. Before starting saying any substantial thing, I want to thank this Centro de Estudios Latinoamericanos from the University of Harvard for gathering us all and to talk about these issues. And thank you to Steve, to Claudio, and to Marcela particularly. I also want to say that it is an honor to comment a presentation by John Kerry, who has been an inspiration for my work always. So I thank this opportunity as well. It is a pleasure to work here. In terms of what we have to go, well, the presentation is quite motivating, the presentation by John Kerry, by saying that there are these two caveats and a question. That is to say, those are the two keys, I would say. I think that all these correlations that he presents are things things that we have to reflect upon, and it's important to dwell on this, on these things, but without considering that this is something that that we cannot leave aside. That is to say, in the literature, this is absolutely present within all this presidential or parliamentary system or the hybrid ones. There is a series of decisions from the institutions that go with a variety of different systems that might be underlying the causes of the different relationships. So it might be possible that we have a correlationship of a presidential systems with countries with kind of a recent economical growth, or a kind of economy which is different from the economies from the parliamentarist developed countries. So this relationship, the Europeans particularly, the parliamentarians, and what are the countries in Latin America which are presidentialist, cannot be absent from our analysis, particularly in the sense that many of these systems, particularly the parliamentary ones and the hybrid ones, have been perfecting their institutional systems detail by detail, making reforms to perfect them, something which Latin America maybe because of the interruptions that we've had based on coup d'etats, or because we have a shorter history, we have had not very many opportunities to do it. This is an opportunity for Chile, after recovering democracy, having a period of democratic stability. We can think in Chile, are these institutions the ones that we need? Are they good for our democracy? Do we want to grow it economically this way? And by answering this, we can then make decisions on the institutional design. So this is in terms of the caveats. Let's think that what is behind these correlations very carefully, I would say. Second point that John was saying, which is very important as well, is that, well, if we make a plebiscite, maybe people would decide for a presidential one, not only for the best reasons, but there is a good reason anyway, which is in all democratic instances, in all opportunities that the citizens can exert their voting, cast their vote. If they can do it more than once, the better. So multiplication of participation, electoral occasions, let's say, it is not something that in Latin America, where the representation is a problem, legitimacy is a problem, the exercise of the citizenship as such is a problem, we have an additional instance to participate could be quite advantageous. When I say that citizens could prefer this kind of reasons, maybe it's because of good reasons. In terms of the feasibility, that going from a presidential one to a parliamentary one, maybe it is low possibilities, I would say few possibilities, because based on the opinions of those working in the Constitution, maybe the new system would be hybrid in nature. But it is very important to see what the diagnosis is. As Pamela said in her presentation, she talked about this diagnosis, some of the crises, the questioning that have been present in the Chilean society that have taken us to the political crisis that today is taking us to the constitutional reform. One of the important aspects here is particularly this concentration of the power in the hands of the executive, the president, and the correlate is emptying the attributions from Congress. That is to say, every time that we see that the executive has got the attribution of an exclusive initiative, well, we are seeing that consequently Congress, the ones who are legislating, they do not have the possibility of initiating any legislation in many different issues. In other systems, it exists, but limited to one issue, to two issues, particularly budget. That is to say, in many constitutions say that the presidency is the one initiating the budget law. But this is something which is quite area, in quite a big area, I would say. We're not talking about issues, we're talking about different areas, 9 different areas, and it gives you the sensation that the citizens are not close to the power, because it is just a representation, but this representation is too far away from them. So this on one hand. On the other hand, we can say that some of these issues are quite key for the citizens, and many of them are the areas that are demanding public policies beyond the political issues, but the complaints of the citizens are in these areas in which the legislation cannot be done by the legislative, in fact. So if this is the diagnosis, and if what we are looking for it is to concentrate the power from the executive towards the Congress and to share it a little bit, it can be quite risky to think that this is going to be achieved in a parliamentary system, because the parliamentary system, we know that they can concentrate more power, even more than in the presidential one. That is to say, in Chile we have a president with lots of attributions, but on the other hand, these attributions are blocked by Congress. The Congress has got this power of reaction and not action. So in the parliamentarian system, this kind of a veto system could not be present, but we could have a stronger concentration in the executive. And the question is whether this is really what this situation of lack of legitimacy of the political system requires. If this could be the solution to the political crisis that we're living, that apparently we are going towards another direction that has to do with multiple instances of representation from the citizens, more participation of the citizens, open ears, and tuning to the needs of the citizens. So I believe I'm just coming to the end of the time, and I'm not going to continue, and I am now open to questions and answers. Thank you very much, and thank you for your timing. We are going then to go to Flavio Quesada. He is a teacher of administrative right in Universidad de Valparaíso. He is a PhD from the Barcelona University in Spain, and he has been working very close to the constituent debate. And yesterday it was your birthday, so happy birthday for you. So I prepared a presentation to guide myself. First of all, let's just thank the invitation for me. It's a honor to be here, particularly sharing this panel with distinguished panel members from Chile. I have to recognize as well that I was just about to reject this invitation because I said, what can I say of interest from this administrative law? But I suppose that if I was invited, is because there was something interesting for me to listen to. So I will try to do it. Question in the seminar gives us three options: the presidential, semi-presidential, or parliamentarist regime. This same question has been presented in the commissions of the assembly, particularly in the political one. But do we have to center this debate only in this question? I think that it is not the case. I am not going to characterize anything here because others can do it much better than me, what can be understood by each of these regimes, but I want to make a reflection that goes for another road. I would say two things, basically. A criticism to the question because it doesn't put into evidence the crucial point that we are living in Chile, and I will give an answer on the second point in terms of what can be answered with this question. I have to say as well that everything that I'm going to say stems from the point of view that I work in, which is the critical juridical theory. With this point of view, I will start with the same bullet, which is the criticism to this question. According to Alain Ballou, we are still living in the Neolithic times when we gave up being nomads and we settled. In mankind, there was a structural distinction which is still present today between the governing people and those who are governed by them. Although we have lived certain moments of truth in which this distinction was evidenced in the surface, it is still present in our day, and the most important creation of it is the modern state, which is what we are rethinking in this constituting process. And this is specifically the social technique through the rulers' rule. The relevant point is that if we understand that this is a right, a manifestation of the exercise of power in terms of techniques to govern us, which is at stake today in Chile, is not this, evidently. That is to say, the only thing that we can find is that there is a new game to generate acceptation by those who are governed through the right, and accepting this right. That is to say, we can say that in rigor, this social outburst that explains this process of today, it starts in the negativity, that is to say, is only rejection, which is not a political possibility opening new to new political possibilities. That is to say, it is just a riot and not a revolution. So the rulers, as they cannot rule ourselves, they only had the possibility to agree a new way to refund a new legality. So it puts into evidence that today there is nothing at stake from the point of view of a radical point, I would say. So I'm quite surprised that certain conservative processes see that this is an opportunity, because in fact it is I would say, quite reliable road to reestablish order. But not all conservative people have the same interest. The same conclusion then makes us understand that Chile is a marginal country in the capital system. Out of it, I don't know whether everything is going to be the same and there will be no opportunities to advance democratically. In fact, we can have strategies, democratic strategies, so that we can allow certain room in order to attempt new strategies not to be ruled, that is to say, to explain the art of not being ruled, just to be closer to Foucault. So understanding of this kind of idealistic thing is a bad way of posing this problem, because we are not going to choose from abstractions, but from the concrete society of today in Chile. We have to agree ways in which the governments and the governors, the rulers, can understand what the process is like. If we cannot be ruled the same way we used to be before, the question is, what is the construction to be adopted? This requires an understanding from two levels: between the elite on how to share and distribute this centralized political power, let's say, but also to rethink social spaces in which the ruled people can have an incidence in terms of what the rulers do. Considering that we are not putting our stake beyond right, beyond the state, beyond institutionality, but legality of today does not control socially the population in terms of governance. The idea is to have a new construct. So the idea is that there should be a political, which is a policy which is necessary in order to understand how we can do in order to see what would be the regime. So it will give us a new construction in the elite and a new idea that comes from the ruled people, from the general population. So from top, it is important that the rulers can agree the way that we are going to be government, and we have to see what are the things that are debated when we talk about the triad of presidentialism, semi-presidentialism, or parliamentarism. But we can tend to think that before, long ago, when there was a blocking between the different political parties, but today this is not the case any longer. Just to put into evidence what I say, we have to see work by Neo d'Avendaño, this institutionality in Chile. It was a book from Lome editorial, which is very interesting for us. And he puts into evidence that it is part as our system, what we understand the attributions of the president are, as well as the big consortia which are the owners of mass media and are determining the public area. This book, which has been widely developed, nevertheless, there is a couple of two topics that are missing in this book. I will say something about this later on, but it's important to see what the legality and legitimacy is from bottom up. That is to say, where we can have some strategies of the art of not being ruled. We need to have the spaces of public incidents. That is to say, we need to progress in order to allow self-management from the population. That is to say, and I believe that is relevant what can be done in terms of fundamental rights. Just an example is recognizing the communities in the schooling, for example, which is very important for the society, and we have to recognize the spaces where we can articulate this, that is to say, to foster a real political decentralization, not only managerial or administratively, as it was during dictatorship, but really political one, that is to say, the local communities, the regions, the different regions of the country can have more decision power in the things that are important for them. Along this line, what has been discussed based on this new regional kind of a state in Chile can be a good road. But up to this point, I believe that the Chilean legality, in order to be able to govern, would require to put special attention in the administrative legality, and this is the vacuum from Avendaño's work. Those are the two works on the public services, the public administration, and the other one on the controller. Why these points are pillars for the political system? Because public services, those who are directly linked to the society, are not only instruments through the political power can be deployed all along the territory of the state, but also it has a key social role, because those are special social spaces in which dignity, equality is something perceptible on a daily basis. And that is to say, there is a room in which we live together and we perceive the other as an equal. Just to put a graph to it, that is to say, if the public school could be the new meeting point of diversity in Chile, so a constitutional declaration that is to say all people born in Chile is equal, is credible and reliable. And obviously the discourses could be more reliable. And if this can be believed, the representation can be believed as well, and therefore can be more accepted that the governors or the rulers can rule us. The same can be in health and more than education and other areas. That is to say, there is no new constitution if there is no a profound administrative reform. And the dictatorship knew that. The state of Chile suffered I would say, one of the biggest administrative reforms in our history. In terms of the controllership, well, obviously, there is a key role here. There are changes to be done so that these public services could fulfill their objectives. I believe that this problem is much more complex. It goes much beyond that the triad which is put in the title of this seminar. Hopefully I said something of interest for you, and thank you for the invitation once again. Thank you very much, Fabio. So it just gives more complexity to the conversation, and obviously, those who have studied institutions, we think of these complexities of the institutional changes. Very interesting, your perspectives. I will go to Lucas Sierra. He is an associate professor of the School of Law, Universidad de Chile, and the director of Centro de Estudios Públicos. He has been quite fruitful in terms of writing, but also in terms of dynamizing um, spaces for debate in several projects that he has headed, particularly in the constitutional change. From 2015 on, a series of volumes on the constitutional change. Thank you, Lucas, for being with us. You have 10 minutes as well. Well, thank you very much, Claudio. We are even colleagues in some of these projects with Claudia that hopefully will see the light at the end of the year. I want to thank Rockefeller Center from Harvard University for the invitation and the presentation from John Kerry, who is quite knowledgeable of Chile. For me, it's a pleasure to be here with distinguished colleagues in this panel. I will take one of these caveats from John at the end of his presentation and this question that he posed at the end. Caveat says, well, that these competitive analyses are interesting, but they have limitations. They are so much aggregated, and when we see the details of it, we see differences. Many details have to do with institutional ecosystems of the different countries, their political culture, tradition, and practice of the political parties. I'm going to talk about this later to add some details of what has been said before. In terms of the question, well, there is a historical inertia for presidentialism. We had a parenthesis after 1891 up to 1932, and we talked about a parliamentaristic area, which is a mistake. It was not, in fact, that. It was a little bit a presidentialism in disorder, because there was an essential element to counteract the responsibility of the cabinet towards the parliament, which was the possibility of the parliament to be dissolved by the president. That is to say, it is not a regime in equilibrium during this period. It is also interesting seeing that during dictatorship that started in 73, there was an effort from the group of the 24. As Ignacio, you know this experience very closely, where there was a proposal for a semi-presidentialism proposal was given formally. But anecdotes say that when they went to President Elwin saying to do this reform, Elwin, that had participated in this group of the 24, he said, it is not time yet. So, and as Pamela said during the process of the constitutional dialogues of President Bachelet, there was a kind of an inclination to modify presidentialism. But if we see the project of a constitution that was left by President Bachelet, supposedly inspired by this process of people's participation, it is just a projection of the old system. As Diego Portales said, that there is the burden of the night in our Chilean culture for presidentialism. What is going to happen in this new constitutional assembly? It is difficult to know. It is a context which politically has been marked by different reforms. Reforms are from the political system. I mean, from 2012, we changed the obligatory voting for a voluntary voting. process, we can talk it over. In 2015, we changed the electoral system. The CERVEL was reinforced, but not fully. In 2016, there was a reform of the political parties and the financing of the political campaign. Last year was the limited re-election. So we're still within the context, which is in the process of change, which is not yet accepted. I believe that the change of this electoral system had a very important consequence, but we are still going to the second election within this new reform, and we are in the context in which the October the 18th, 2019 originated, which obviously put the focus on the political system in a very exceptional way. I believe that this movement, this upheaval, and everything that happens afterwards put a red light to the presidentialistic model that we have. We are living with a mechanism which is absolutely deformed, where we have constitutional reforms with attempts of including taxes, taking or withdrawing money from the pensions. That is to say, the system is absolutely overridden, and which it is absolutely discontrol, I would say, because in fact, on the one hand, we have lots of constitutional accusations that are showing that the system, in fact, needs a change, a real change. With an additional component, we are starting this reform from a blank sheet. This means that if we do not come to an agreement, if this is not if this is not approved, then we are going to go back to the previous institutionality and the constitution. So how this is going to be, or how big this burden is going to be for the new reform, is something that we have to see in the future. How we can characterize this? We can think of a nucleus and the periphery of the system. Nucleus is given by the relationship between the executive and the legislative and the system of elections, etc. My hypothesis is that they were absolutely disaggregated. I believe that in 2015 there was an important change that was done. The binominal system had several defects, but it was excessively proportional, and today gave us the possibility of having 16 different political parties. In Chile, we have a multi-partyistic tradition, which is rooted in our society, no doubt, and that dictatorship, as Pamela said, could not modified, although they put in effectiveness this binominal kind of institution. Ignacio will tell us a little bit on this later on. And after this electoral law, 18 new political parties have been created. So this is excessive. So this is our tradition, multi-party district, but having 25 political parties, 16 of them in the parliament, is absolutely non-functional, definitely. So there should be a limit to what historically can be traced back. That is to say, in terms of what the power of the president is. Only working, or only given the possibility of having new legislation in terms of budgeting. This means that the minority that can be of the support to the government is absolutely exacerbated. Arturo Valenzuela also said that the second round, the second term, or the second round, sorry, for the elections in order to solve the crisis that we used to live in the 70s is within this context, this second round has created another problem area because it gives us the possibility of having double minority presidencies. That is to say, it doesn't give good political conditions to govern afterwards, because you can have pacts before the election but not afterwards, and therefore we have just to put an eye on the second round, because it diminishes the possibility of having good coalitions to make sure that the governance or the governability of the country will go on a good road. Another point is the Constitutional Tribunal that intervenes in the relationship between the Congress and government. There is a lot of autonomous agencies that are influencing as well in this political regime, like the central bank or the controllership, etc. We are discussing the way of the state, the form of the state, the polity of the state, and I think that there is something very important in, particularly when we're talking about a more parliamentaristic system, is to have a civil service that is professional and in good shape. That is to say, an administration that is really professional, not subject to the political cycle. Particularly is in this new cycle, as I hope Congress will have much bigger influences and much more responsibilities, because this little responsibility that they have today had made us taking decisions or making decisions which are not responsible. I would say that those are the typical institutional problems that we needed to give solution to the institutional problems. Hopefully, what we have out of it is as semi-presidentialism or whatever it is. But today we are risking to putting labels on all those different positions. What are the problems? The problem is that we need a system that would unblock the problem that we have in the relationship between the Congress and the government. Today, this system is not under control. In fact, if it is semi-parliamentarism, that's okay, fantastic. How we can unblock it is to give a clear distinction between what is the role of the state, what is the role of the government, and the role of the Congress, and that all problems can be solved through a political way and not the judicial way. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lucas, and thank you for your time. We are going to go to the last one. Last but not least, Ignacio Walker. He's a senior researcher from CIE Bland. He is a teacher at Universidad Católica in Valparaiso. PhD in political science, and former minister. I'm not going to read it all, but he has been quite interested in institutional issues and defining or writing on this issue as well. So thank you, Ignatius, to be here with us in this panel. Thank you very much, Claudio, Claudia, Marcela, from all the team, Rockefeller Center, and all the colleagues that have participated in the panel, and the people who are following us in the debate. John Kerry is right, and congratulations for this introduction in terms that the people would like to choose the president. To say, obviously, if you just make a survey, evidently people would like to choose the president. In the case of Chile, though, practically nobody is defending the presidentialism as it is today. Many defend presidentialism in general terms, but not the one that we have. So there is room for innovation. That would be my first reaction to this statement from John. I will start by my conclusion. If I had to give a recommendation to the assembly, I would say let's go for a system of government that distinguishes between the president as the head of a state and the prime state, the prime minister as the head of the government, particularly in the multi-partyistic system that we have. We have a presidentialism through history, which is like the Andes, and a multi-partyistic problem, which is a smaller range of mountains in Chile. If we have to distinguish between the head of a state and head of the government, there are two possibilities. Either semi-presidentialism or parliamentarism. So I will be I will do my criticism on the presidentialistic system that we have today in Chile and in Latin America. What is the desirable constitution, as Charles de Gaulle said? Tell me where and how. So I say that Uruguay, Costa Rica, and Chile in Latin America are in better conditions in order to go for a parliamentaristic system. Why? Because we are complete democracies according to the democracy index. But today we had an upgrading, and we became part of this triad. So there are the parties, a political system, which is a little bit more settled, I would say, but not for all Latin America. But I believe that these three countries that I mentioned can. Presidentialism in Chile through history has got a serious weak point, which is not being capable of addressing deep political problems. Presidentialism through the 1800s was quite stable, but it went into a civil war in 1891. In the 20th century, we had a coup d'etat, a dictatorship in 1973. I am not even saying that there is a relationship of causality, system of government and democratic stoppage. So be careful with correlations, Carrie say. There is something that we need to research on that in terms of understanding what is the presidentialist moment that we are living today. The same happened in 2019, October the 18th. But presidentialism, as we have it today, shows that when we have to be put into test, which is the political crisis, not to become a crisis of the system, shows signals of exhaustion. And in the root of everything, we see the super concentration of power in the president as the head of a state, head of the government, leader of the coalition, and the rigidity that says that we have a presidentialistic period which is absolutely fixed, 4 years. So those aspects explain the difficulty of the Chilean presidentialism in order to face deep political crisis. 1891, 1924, the crisis of 73, and October the 18th that we are living today. What do we have today in Chile? We have an executive and legislative blocking, fragmentation of political parties, that is to say 25 political parties, proliferation of constitutional accusation, that is to say those impeachment, which is 36 accusations in the last 31 years. Only 4 has been accepted. Two, against the president of the government, the president of Chile. Is that the solution? I prefer to have a parliamentaristic mechanism in order to address and to face this crisis moment. What I am describing, and many other characteristics, are characteristic of the presidentialism that we are living today. It is not the parliament to blame in here. All the things that I mentioned before. Parliamentarism never existed in Chile. Lucas said it. I have written about that. In Chile, they say that parliamentarism failed from 1891 to 1924. It failed. We never had it. This so-called parliamentarism system was inexistent. There was a president elected for a fixed period, and he was the head of a state, head of government, and he could not dissolve parliament. So what are we talking about? This is just presidentialism. It is not parliamentarism. As some of us have listened, this is, I would say, a different kind of parliamentarism or presidentialism. I would say parliamentarism is the one that appoints a head of a state, a head of government. Nevertheless, the historians said that they used to have, or we used to have, a parliamentaristic model, and it failed. But in fact, I say that it was never the case. So deconcentration of this the power, head of a state, head of government, and the flexibility are some of the advantages for a country such as Chile, I would say Uruguay maybe, of particularly in order to face the political crisis. I insist that this could not become a crisis of the system. Additionally, political coalitions in a parliamentary system, they are done after the election. We just count the votes, and then ex post we have a parliamentary coalition. But in our model, we have to do the coalitions before the elections is done, and there is different mechanisms, maybe prohibiting the pacts that can be used. Well, those mechanisms in the parliamentary and the presidential system anyway, as well as the possibility of voting for a candidate or a party, like in Germany or New Zealand. This is something that we are learning. What is opposing to this parliamentary system? Four things. The idea that we are presidentialistic in nature. Second, prejudice towards parliamentarism. We say that parliamentarism failed, although it was never attempted to be done. Three, the tradition of voting directly to the president. Mr. Fontaine says, well, we cannot go against this tradition, that is to say that people elect the president directly. And three, lack of prestige in parliament. We cannot have parliamentarism with this parliament, which is so is suffering from this lack of prestige. And here we have the possibility, for me, a second best, of the semi-presidentialism, although I've got some doubts. Distinguish it at least between the head of a state and head of government, together with the possibility of questioning the president, which is not impeachment as such. And certainly last but not least, there is a very clear and deep issue that we have to mention here. There is a much bigger menace and threat towards democracy. How we can defend democracy? There is much more threat in presidentialism than in parliamentarism, because presidentialism is the discourse of the outsiders, from those who are far from the system. We can say, well, the new leaders, the new caudillos, as we say in Spanish, which are full in Latin America. So in parliamentarism, we have institutional logics working, particularly in Latin America, where I defend, and it's a book that I wrote, Democracy in Latin America, and I say that the dilemma in Latin America is between the democracy of institutions, that is to say, the tradition of the representative, constitutional, deliberative democracy. This is the democracy of institutions, taken from the Alcivolsky case, that is to say, is the system of institutions versus democracy of the leaders, caudillos, as we say in Spanish, which is from another tradition, that is to say, the populist, plebiscite-based democracy. As Guillermo Tonner said, this is the dilemma of Latin America, and I say that the representative one is the first best in relationship to the direct or participatory democracy, which is something that I cannot talk about here. So the thesis of this presidentialism of coalitions, that is to say, quite interesting in the last 15 or 20 years, is to be revised in the light of the Chilean case. If a country which is presidentialist and multipartidistic, these two ranges of mountains, could come into coalition, this is Chile, but we are far away for coming to the stability, sustainability of the system. So I believe that in Latin America, Uruguay, Chile, maybe Costa Rica could be in better conditions as complete democracies with parties and political cultures which are much more stable. I wouldn't recommend it for the rest of Latin America, at least for now. And I share what Lucas Sierra says, that we have to see this triad, system of government, system of elections, and system of parties. This is the real challenge. There is a proposal from Espacio Público, from Daniel Sajuria, very interesting. It just an end with my sentence. Be careful with correlations. But is it for chance that Europe, which is the most stable political area in the world, totally parliamentarian, but France and others, and on the other hand, Latin America, which is the most unstable area in the world, 100% presidentialist, well, be careful with correlationships. But there is something that we have to analyze in that. Thank you very much for your attention. Okay, thank you, Ignacio, and thanks to all panel members. I assume that there are comments, as there has been some interesting problem areas that can be commented upon. We have little time, and we still have only 30 minutes left, so I will try to synthesize some questions, and the ones who want to take it can respond freely. But certainly you can take the comments from any other panel member as well. Clearly, here we have different options, diverse options. Some say careful with changes, so significant changes, such as going to parliamentarism, for example. We are all in agreement in the panel in moving towards attenuating or changing some power correlationships. Flavio says, well, not only be careful with this debate on the rulers and how the elite put order in power, but we have to see other dimensions, as well as Lucas introduces an element, and Valeria and Pamela. Well, Pamela started with a direct proposal, quite interesting, and Valeria says we have to think of this gearing the different institutional figures, because this will affect development. I've got three levels of questions. One has to do with the context, which is very important, the diagnosis. The diagnosis to explain certain political processes. I'm gathering the questions that popped up in the chat. I would just do a synthesis of them. But there are two questions on diagnosis which are interesting. One is from Roberto saying, can we talk about hyper-presidentialism if in practice this has not been expressed? There is a whole group of colleagues saying that, well, the president in Chile has got formal power, very strong. Nevertheless, in practice, it has not been the case. So there is a debate on whether this hyper-presidentialism is overrated, and maybe in reality it might not be the case. And Lucas and Valeria can elaborate on this a bit. Second, diagnosis question as well. We had the binominal in 2016-17. This electoral system was changed for a proportional based one. Is this a factor that accounts for what is going on today or not? Today, in what are we living today? And once again, we have these changes in the electoral system, more fragmentation. Was it a triggering point that is expressed in the political system today? And it would be interesting seeing how, in one part of this equation, what is your vision for the vision of the importance of these electoral systems? The second level of questions, is directed to John, which is the first question done in the chat that had to do with up to what extent the figures, the data that you are sharing, are representatives of what has been said. That is to say, there are lines, and question is, are these lines significant, the ones that you show? And secondly, the question on what are the factors that could account for or explain this bigger correlation between inequality in income or wealth in a political system. That is to say, they would be asking for the causality. What would be your inference out of it? Melissa asks another question, quite interesting question. Who manages money? That is to say, public expenditure. Who is going to have this initiative? And I would ask Ignacio, Pamela, Lucas, to all of you, how could you imagine a model in terms of who has got the wallet, in fact? Because this question of who is the one managing, administering the money is basic when distributing power. So there is a whole vision in Chile saying that this could not be given to the parliamentaries, to the parliament people, because this is going to be a populist system. But proof is that in the parliamentary system do not behave this way. So there is a debate on public expenditure. Who controls the wallet? Is it in the hands of the parliament? Is it in the hands of the president, etc.? And finally, an open question as well has to do with the bigger polarization level, with this character of Kast, José Antonio Kast, that comes into the political scenario, and how this could have an influence into the constitutional process. In this, how could implement in terms of the implementation of a new constitution. Imagine a scenario in which a new constitution comes and in a right-wing kind of a government. So this is just an hypothesis, it's not a claim though. So I've got several other questions, so maybe you can answer them directly in the chat, but as the time goes on, we have a 2 minutes intervention for each of you to answer these questions. Let's go in the same order. So John, this is your turn, please.
Sure, thank you. And just quickly, people had asked, are the statistical relationships that I showed significant? And the scatter plots don't show that, but the linear best fit lines that I show also include confidence intervals around those relationships. And in almost every case that I showed, the confidence intervals for the presidential regimes were non-overlapping with those for the parliamentary and hybrid regimes. And so we can say, by conventional metrics of statistical significance, yes, these are discernible relationships. That does not change the caveat that I finished with, which is that these are just correlations. So yeah, they're correlations that are statistically discernible, but they don't meet the standards of that we would normally set for causal inference. Now, we unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, we don't run randomized control trials with constitutional regime type. So this is an area of political science in which our ability to identify causality is probably the most challenging. And for that reason, I'm very cautious about the conclusions that I draw from these. But the question asked, what kind of factors do I think could explain these differences? I mean, if there is a causal effect of regime type on these outcomes that we care about, which all focused on human well-being, I think it's that collective action is particularly difficult in presidential systems. And that's by design. Presidential systems are fundamentally adversarial. Right? There is no common survival between the branches, and so they're designed to foster conflict between the branches. There's a reason for that, because adversarial relationships are very good at revealing information. So if we fundamentally distrust government, and our main concern is that we need, we want to prioritize the revelation of information about what's going on in government, then presidentialism is actually a pretty good solution, because the inherent conflict between the branches is going to, sort of foster this revelation of information. But if our priority with institutional design is to foster cooperation and action by the government, then presidentialism has some real liabilities. So it is more difficult to act. It's more difficult to legislate. It's more difficult to raise taxes. It's more difficult to put in place the kinds of public programs that might foster some of these measurements of human well-being that I focused on in my presentation. And that's, I think that is if people ask for what do I think are the factors that explain the differences across the regimes, I think That is a basic summary. I'll stop and turn it back to the Chilean experts.
Okay, let's go with Pamela. Let's continue the same order. So thank you, Claudio. I'm going directly to the questions that affect me. Hyper-presidentialism is a debate. It is a term that I use, the one that was coined by an Argentinian author. It is important to understand how the system is blocked today, because these hyper faculties of the president generate attention with the Congress. When the Congress is full of different political parties, there is a tension which is cooperative between the two powers. We have seen this in many cases in the last year. We have seen the parliament looking for formulae through the constitutional reforms in order to face the president. It's not only the political opposition going or taking this option, also the followers of the president have followed the same opinion. In terms of the change of the binominal to the moderate proportional system that we have today, it has affected the system. But there is a difference of what Lucas said, because before this change, there were 12 parties with representation in Congress. That is to say, fragmentation is prior to this change. This is just a reaction to the fragmentation. I mean, to the reform of the binominal. And the kind of negotiation that was given meant that we have to lower the threshold to admit the new political parties to come into Congress. So thresholds were lowered, and open lists as well. The kind of lists we have in Chile increases hyper-individualization of politics, which is something that I mentioned before. And also, I do believe that the reform of 2015 and others came afterwards, financing, the CERVEL, the quotas included, etc., maybe the most important one in the last years, tend to be integral, but it was not integral. So the way of making an integral political reform is in the Constitution. It is the moment in which the political people are not there, where we can have this debate in an integral way. So that is why I believe it's superlative to analyze whether the system that we want, the electoral system that we want, to understand how we can respond to the question of political regime and how we can have this majority. Public expenditure is exclusive to the president, I would say. There is several comparative analysis. John Stifier can explain this better than us, as in the United States cases. And this is quite complex because of the distribution of power, because in Chile will tend to plurinationality and the regionalized state, which are very clear options in the Constitutional Assembly. So this public expenditure has to be exclusively in the hands of the president. But if we happen to have a political regime that would incorporate direct democracy mechanisms, such as the case of Uruguay, this referendum for this substantial reforms in the constitution, it can work. And in terms of polarization, several studies show that polarization comes from the elite and not from the general population. This has been exacerbated in Chile, but I believe that, as history shows, every time that there are substantial changes done and important reforms done, as this one or any other in history, the elite reacts. In previous historical moment, as Ignacio and Luca said, the military people, they played an important role in this reaction. Today, they do not have a role. I believe that this is a very special characteristic of the constitutional process in Chile, and the reaction comes from the conservative areas, very clear, as a strategy of fake news and disinformation, lots of questioning to the surveys, etc. But I also believe that this contradiction that we can see between the political moment of 2019, 2021 has suffered the influence of the pandemic and the new reform. And there is an over estimation of this 80% that the approval won in the plebiscite, and this is obviously worth of analyzing. Now we go to Valeria. Thank you once again. Thank you again. I want to be brief. Once again, I want to react to some things that have been said here. I don't know if we can answer to all questions, but in general terms, hopefully we can do it. A couple of things that John said, which are very, very clear. John said that in the presidential system is a system that puts the interests of the parliament against the executive. In Latin America, this logic has been violated as well. That is to say, at least in my understanding of the presidential system, it's one of the problems of Latin America. Although we have this presidential system with a logic that there is a counteracting that would operate, in Latin America it does not operate. So this is a weird kind of a combination that we have congresses that try to do things but they cannot. But John said, and this is very important for the Chilean context, that the presidential system are particularly good in facilitating access to information, and in the cases in which the lack of trust of the government is high, a presidential system would facilitate information to the citizens. It would neutralize some powers, etc. So in Chile, we do not have problems of efficiency in government, but we have a tremendous problem on legitimacy of the government. That is to say, we came into the crisis of 2019 with levels of legitimacy which are very low. In Chile, they are just on the floor. Despite results of public policies that are, I would say, decent. Reduction of poverty, which is respectable, but despite all this, we come to this crisis of 2019 with a tremendous legitimacy crisis. Growing corruption problems as well. That is to say, understanding the presidentialistic system in this context could make problems still worse. So we have to see what the problems that we're facing in Chile today, and the remedy can be still worse. In terms of fragmentation, though, and the electoral system, and I want to respond to something that Ignacio said. Chile, said Ignacio, is the ideal context so that the presidentialism of coalitions could work, and it has not worked. This would be caveat as well. Everything makes me think that in Chile, this coalition did not work because the constitution was created to avoid precisely that. So this proposal of a binominal that tries to diminish this fragmentation propose a logic of a coalition that is absolutely contrary to the multipartidistic history of Chile. If we wanted to design a system in Chile to operate in coalition systems in Chile, could make me think that this would understand that there was work in Chile fantastically well. But in terms of fragmentation, I share this concern because we have to make sure stability. But the problem in Chile is not having 16 political countries in parliament. The thing is that we have independent people working in the constitution today. So the challenge is to avoid levels of fragmentation, but with a system of parties. And going against the current could give us to what was the result in the Constitutional Assembly members, which almost all of them are independent from the political parties. So that is to say, the same happens to the system. The system was not reformed, and obviously it went over us. Sometimes the avalanche comes anyway, and this would be then my final words. Thank you, Valeria. Flavio, please. Thank you, Claudio. I would, well, many things have come. All of them are quite interesting, but I'm just going to answer the question on me, which is the citizens' participation. Just mentioning that how we can go to recognize the places where we can then create more solidarity. What would I to say with these things? First of all, is well, you have explained it better than me that in Chile we have lived a system or a process of fragmentation that we are reconfiguring now, and this is quite valuable, creating new spaces, the institutionality being created based on new laws can be quite useful. So this is quite interesting. But this, I would say, popular appropriation of the constitution, let's say, the constitutional process, I see that it is a process that cannot go backwards, definitely. So it's very difficult to go backwards. And in terms of deformalization, this solidarity is something that I put as an idea, saying that it really makes me a lot of sense. When the state gives social services, they try to formalize social solidarity, and this is something that has to be perceived by the one who lives it. I think that we can go forward to give some spaces to some communities that are really existing. For example, the educative or the educational community, or some health services being rendered. I believe that this way it is possible that you can perceive something real, the declarations that are being included in the Constitution, that we are all equal before the law. But I want to close my words with some ideas, as people say, or used to say, that the political scientists should not be heard. I think the contrary. Our history has got two big areas, two big opinions. Positivistic, formalistic one, which is associated to the public universities, and another one to the Catholic universities. So, and this is very interesting to understand what we are living. So the opening towards social politics, it should be very wide. And I also believe that the faculties of the laws, or the school of laws, that create the representations on the judicial things should be based on the constitutional aspect. But this is another thing and another topic that I have to go to another area. So now we go to Flavio. No, lawyer or Attorney Lucas will talk now. So this is a critical view from an administrative professor, administrative judicial professor. Thank you, Claudio. On hyper-presidentialism, I believe that this is true. We have to make a distinction between the formal faculties of the government and the real ones. I believe that the real ones is where the problem lies. There was, that is to say, a president has not institutionality enough in order to put all the followers into the discipline. That is why we have talked about this this word that it means that you are out of control. That is to say, the parliament people are re-elected, but not the president, and that is to say. And that is why the president, they lose popularity. So there is a bad cocktail here. Is a president that cannot be re-elected, but parliaments that can be re-elected. And this means that the parliamentary people, they just can abandon ship very quickly. And we see it very often. Hyper-presidentialism in the way that we have, well, in fact, the president has got lots of formal power and in the public administration as well. Nevertheless, I would say that the power still lies in the president, and we cannot talk about a good civil service in good shape, I would say, as I mentioned before. In terms of the electoral system, well, this has got different causes. It explains the fragmentation of the Congress somehow. And I would coincide with Pamela that we used to have it before. But now this is quite acute in the context that we are living today with different laws, etc., where the problem of fragmentation is multiplied. And a last point, well, I'm not against the political parties, though. There should be ease to create political parties, but to be careful with independence, because the political parties, they should have the privilege of being representatives. In fact, repeating the mistake of having these independent lists is going to be disastrous, I would say. And it has to do with public expenditure, because we have to link, possibly enough, the power and responsibility. And along this line, political parties, they should have the power because they are to be responsive. And in the possibility of universalizing the different interests, the interest towards the whole society. This is the function of them, to make all possible things universal. And who manages the wallet? The one who is responsible. In a presidential system, the responsibility should lie in, and the power is in the executive. In a parliamentary system, it should be in the one who is responsible of the government. Where, for example, I would say the Spanish system or others. And another thing, not everything in this constitution is constitutional. It is a possibility to check the whole system, but not everything should be given to the constitution. In terms of the political parties, do not make the same mistake as the constitution of the 80s. We have to create some criteria orienting the future legislation that would be functional and compatible with the relationship between the government and the parliament. The same happens to the political parties, to orientate the criteria for this electoral law. But not everything is going to be put in the hands of the constitution. Not everything can be tied to the constitution. This is quite dictatorial. But criteria so that democracy can work in the future. Thank you. Thank you, Lucas. And finally, Ignatius. 1 minute of each for the 3 different questions. Hyper-presidentialism, well, we have used this concept, all of us. There is Christopher Martinez, an interesting work to question the thesis of hyper-presidentialism. We can talk about reinforced presidentialism, but I talk about the presidentialism as it is today, with the Chilean characteristics. And we all know what is going on today. That is to say, it's a very robust, strong, reinforced presidentialism. No need of putting more adjective because it's strong enough. Second, very important, the electoral system is binominal, or used to be binominal. January the 30th, 2015, we put an end to the binominal one. I had to do with it. I was a senator, president of the Social Democrats. We worked with different people very strongly with all the consultants. There was a very difficult operation. Why? Because we had votes in the representatives, but in the Senate we had 3 independent votes. All the right-wing parties vote against the binominal. Why? Because this system favored the second political force, that was the right-wing parties. So we did good in putting an end to this binominal that had no legitimacy. Serious problems over application, the subsidies of the big countries towards the small ones, difficulties in making alliances, etc. I know that many people still defend the binominal system, but we did good in putting an end to it. We went to a moderate proportional system. Some districts only have 8 representatives. In Sao Paulo, in Brazil, they have almost 80. And 5 senators. What is the problem? Is that we don't have a threshold. We have to introduce a threshold. Germany, they have 50 political parties. Because they are federal, 6 of them are represented in parliament. It makes things much easier. So the threshold wouldn't be 8 or 5%, but at least 3 or 4%, just to filter some, not to eliminate the possibility of having a new political party coming into, but to have a political representation and end of the alliances. That is to say, each political party should be measured on its own. We used to have it. In Chile, we used to have 6 effective political parties in the 60s. And voting for a candidate and a party, such as Germany and New Zealand, that would be very important from the point of view of representation and governability. So I believe that Chile has got to have a proportional system because we have lots of political parties. And finally, with the exclusivity of the executive, I defend the initiative of the exclusive initiative of the executive. We did a publication with Mr. Sierra. There is a presentation from Rodrigo Vergara. He studied, or he analyzed, the presidential system, the semi-presidential one and the parliamentarian one. Because in Chile, it is not abstract. In the Constitution of the 25, when the expenditure was given to the president, it was because there was a civil war in 1891. Then Juan Antonio Rios in 43 extended this exclusive initiative to the creation of public services, etc. And Eduardo Frei Montalva in 1970 introduced the exclusive initiative of the executive for the pensions, because the fiscal crisis was incredible in 1970. I would eliminate other things like collective bargaining, etc. But in terms of wallet expenditure, it should be in the hands of the president. I will defend this mechanism anyway. Thank you. Well, we have been for 2 hours, more than 120 persons, and now we have 90% of people following us. So quite interesting for many people. I want to thank all of you, particularly John Kerry, Harvard certainly, Steve if is here, Marcella, and Selena, that they have been coordinating this work, and certainly Ignatius, Flavio, Valeria, Pamela, and Lucas for their interesting participation. This is an issue that is hot today. It is the moment of the political scientists which are interested in these areas, and the constitutional lawyers as well, and the constitutionalists that certainly had put a dynamism to this debate. An important debate. This is very important for the democracy, and we are going to have this kind of a meeting in the future. I want to thank you all, and with this, we just end this event. Thank you very much to all of you.